You all know Victoria Nuland. She is part of the Neocon blob. She's part of this foreign policy establishment of the United States. She is a top war hawk. She has specialized in especially the question of Russia. She has made a career over building up a hawkish record toward Russia. And what she is known most for is during her time in the Obama administration's Department of State as the Assistant Secretary for European Affairs, she is known as the architect of the 2014 coup, which arguably, if not undeniably so, paved the way to what we're seeing now with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the Russia special military operation, the Ukraine crisis, whatever you want to call it. What's happening in Ukraine right now is in large part due to the US's sponsored coup in Ukraine. And she was a huge architect of that coup. Okay. She was passing out cookies and sandwiches on Maidan Square, right? She was a huge supporter of the so-called Maidan Revolution, which was primarily and mainly a U.S. paid for and sponsored protest movement that, of course, had a violent right-wing fascistic neo-Nazi, downright Nazi forces leading the charge as the vanguard of that. And they were the ones who were able to topple Viktor Yanukovych, who was a democratically elected president at that time, all because Victoria Nuland and her team in the Obama administration, in the neocons, they didn't like Yanukovych for him stating and really pushing for a balanced relationship between Europe and Russia. So he denied isolating Russia. He refused to sign on to huge cuts in pension and energy subsidies. He refused that, and he was ousted by the United States' backed forces. And Victoria Nuland was a huge part of that. And so you all remember the leaked phone call, right? She had a leaked phone call where she was literally choosing who was going to be the next person to run Ukraine's government after Yanukovych's ouster. It was eventually a gentleman named Yatsenyuk, and she chose him. She was pushing for him. And she also was caught on record saying F the EU. She doesn't care what the EU thinks. And that went viral. That call went viral. And it demonstrated just how callous a neocon she was and how she was all about her political career as a force of regime change against Russia, using Ukraine as a huge stepping stone. So Victoria Nuland has a long history of this, right? She was the CEO of the Center for New American Security before she entered the Department of State. That think tank is a weapons contractor, military contractor funded think tank, US government funded think tank that experiments, tests out, studies how to wage war and how to wage war against these bigger powers, these new targets that the United States has set its sight on, Russia and China. So the Center for New American Security is a really important think tank at the moment, leading this drive ideologically and militarily to this end game that we are seeing. And the neocons are the leading force. And of course, as I said earlier, Victoria Nuland is married to Robert Kagan, the founder of the Project for a New American Century, which essentially is the doctrine of the neocon agenda. That's what the Project for a New American Century is. It is about eliminating and eradicating any country, any nation that stands up for itself, that asserts any kind of self-determination. Doesn't matter if this country is trying to develop a completely different alternative economic model in its own path, or if it's just by a policy or two, because that's what Yanukovych was not seeking to massively change the political chessboard or anything like that. He was just calling for a more balanced trade relationship, a more balanced political relationship between contending forces, and he could not be allowed to maintain power. And so it could be as small as that or as significant as that from the perspective of someone like Victoria Nuland, or it could be as big as a country like China and even Russia, which are charting a multipolar world and are charting a path toward self-determination and a new world, right? A new world relationship that isn't dictated by U.S. empire. So now Victoria Nuland is the Undersecretary of State under Antony Blinken. She is not first in command or second command, but she is still a very influential figure in the State Department of the United States. And so this past Thursday, just a couple days ago on January 26th, she briefed the Senate in a hearing about the situation in Ukraine, and she had a lot to say. And I can just summarize some of those things before I get into exactly what parts I want to talk about. But she had a lot to say. First, she, of course, reasserted the United States is not going to allow Ukraine to lose. They're going to win. Ukraine is going to define winning, and we're going to help them permanently. We want to, she called Putin a war criminal. She almost was indicating that there was like a Yugoslavia model here, that the United States, once Ukraine had won and once Putin gave up territory, and that was the only term she said that would be allowable in any kind of negotiated settlement, that Russia would have to give up everything that it has gained during this conflict, and that Ukraine would only get security guarantees if that were the case. So she was basically saying no negotiated settlement with Russia, not even anything close to that. But she was also kind of hinting that Putin should be charged for war crimes over Ukraine. And, it was really kind of everything you would expect from Victoria Nuland, someone who despises Russia, who's made her whole career up until this point, building to this moment. Really everything about her political life, her political career hinges on this proxy war, this NATO-led proxy war, US-led proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. And because she was the one who helped set the fire. She was the one who helped spark the flame with the coup. So she, of course, said a lot of things that weren't so surprising. But there were 2 points I wanted to highlight about her briefing that were going around on social media because people found them very significant, and I find them very significant too. Now let's talk about first the Nord Stream pipeline disaster. You all remember this happened earlier in 2022. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, although Nord Stream pipelines, because there's Nord Stream 1 and 2, they were subject to a sabotage attack, a terrorist attack, and they were destroyed, right? They were destroyed. They were utterly destroyed. And of course, now we have some more evidence that it probably has Western handprints and footprints and there's a lot of evidence from Joe Biden's own comments, right? Saying that, it was Joe Biden who said all the way back in, I believe it was February, when this before the special military operation started, he said, oh yeah, we're going to make sure Nord Stream 2 is not operational. Then you had Antony Blinken say, oh, this is a big opportunity for U.S. LNG suppliers, U.S. monopolies. And then you had, of course, the Liz Truss text message saying it's done. And a lot of people thought that that was an indication that maybe the UK was helping the United States sabotage the pipeline. Now, there's not been any definitive investigation. The heads of the Nord Stream pipeline, those who produced it, it was a German-Russian partnership, remember. They've said it's not Russia, and the corporate media tried to pin it on Russia. But we still don't know who exactly did it, because countries that are supposed to be investigating it, right? There's Nordic countries, there's Germany. They're not really doing their due diligence, okay? Because there's obviously something to hide. Well, nonetheless, Victoria Nuland had a very interesting comment to make about the Nord Stream pipeline attack. Okay, this comment, I think, shows not just that the United States may be implicated, right, to the disastrous attack that happened back in September of 2022, but it also demonstrates just how subservient the EU is, in particular Germany, because this was really Germany's project. Remember, Germany under Angela Merkel basically went on their hands and knees to Russia saying, we really need you to supply this LNG to us. We really want this pipeline. We have a frayed relationship. We don't really like you. I'm sure you have feelings toward us, given just how this new Cold War was already starting to develop. But at the same time, Germany said, we need this. And so these comments by Victoria Nuland are just demonstrative of how unhinged not only a neocon she is, but how subservient EU countries, especially Germany, a leading EU country, really seen as maybe the top European power in NATO, how subservient they are in Germany is, because these comments should honestly prompt an investigation, in my opinion, right? If I were, let me see, I'm trying to find it. If I were uh, Germany, I would say we need to investigate this now, because your comments are very suspicious. Okay, your comments are making us feel like you are very happy that this is happening. Okay, so Aaron Mate posted this clip where she commented on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline bombing, and I want you to hear what she had to say. So here we go.
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. Senator Cruz.
A hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea. So let's hear that. You got to hear that again.
Senator Cruz, like you, I am, and I think the administration is very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea.
So she's talking to Ted Cruz, right? Supposedly an adversary of the Biden administration, right? Ted Cruz doesn't have a lot of nice things to say about the Democratic Party, and he makes up this larger wing in the Republican Party that's now starting to question Ukraine war funding, right? That's the big political divide happening right now. How is this money being used? Republicans are the champions of austerity, and the Ukraine war now can be seen as even though they all support a war on Russia to some degree, there's no friends of Russia in either party. But in order to score political points, because this is a Democratic Party war, people like Ted Cruz are saying, well, what's the deal with all of this money being spent? And Victoria Nuland says comments like these in order to build what she thinks is a rapport with the other side. So Victoria Nuland basically said, I am happy, just like you, Mr. Cruz, that Nord Stream 2 is a hunk of scrap at the bottom of the sea, that it is sunk to the bottom of the sea because that cripples Russia. But it also cripples Germany. And that was always the point. And so here you have Victoria Nuland, an unhinged neocon, someone who's made her whole career building up to regime change against Russia, essentially admit that she is happy and the administration is happy that Nord Stream 2 is no longer operational. This is part of the reason why Germany, despite this warmer than usual winter, despite the fact that the EU as a whole has been more optimistic about its prospects with energy, right? The energy crisis supposedly hasn't been as bad as it could have been, although prices are still pretty high. Of course, that's how the United States and Europe love to talk about economic crises. It's not as bad as it could have been, right? But it's still pretty bad. But nonetheless, Germany has honestly taken the brunt of it and is still in this process of deindustrialization, in large part because of this pipeline's destruction. And so the fact that Victoria Nuland can say such a thing, this hawkish, neocon, unhinged commentary in front of the US Senate, and Germany not say one word about it, Germany not say, wait a minute, that's strange. You're our so-called ally in NATO. You're our so-called partner against Russia. And you're basically cheering for something that damages Germany more than Russia, honestly, at this point, because Russia has found ways to export its LNG, to export its gas and its oil without these pipelines, even if it has ensured that maybe economic growth will be smaller. but Russia has figured things out. Germany is the one that needs to import. Do you know what I'm saying? Germany needs to import this energy, and it has lost a major pipeline from Russia in order to do so. And so that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning, because there's also this question of tanks, right? And so we know that the United States and Germany and the UK and Holland and, Netherlands, these countries have all decided to pledge some number of heavy tanks, right? Whether it's the M1A1 Abrams that the United States is providing, I think it's a little over 30. Whether it's the German Leopards, which I think there's like a range of how many may be provided. It's some big range. And then, of course, the other countries are starting to chip in as well. But a huge point about the tanks has been, and this has been admitted by military brass. This has been admitted by those who understand this, right? Brian Berletic has covered this a lot. Ukraine is not even where it needs to be from the beginning of February 24, 2022, when the special military operation began and Ukraine started fighting. Ukraine was heavily armed at that time. Ukraine had built up over 8 years, right? I think more than 1,000 tanks, right? Thousands upon thousands of other kind of weaponry that was, a lot of it, of course, was its own, right? Soviet weaponry, former Soviet weaponry, and then, of course, the lethal aid that the United States provided. And it had a lot of time to do that over the course of months and years. But the United States, essentially what happened is Ukraine, through its offensives, Kharkov, Kherson, these offensives that happened right around this middle point of where we are now in the 1 year coming for this proxy war. Ukraine basically, blew through all of it. Blew through. It was all gone, right? Russia shot it all down. Russia didn't even have to partially mobilize before getting rid of all that weaponry. And essentially, the United States and NATO are tasked with rearming Ukraine. Well, of course, there's a lot of optimism about this. That's all war propaganda, right? It's all there's. Yes, Ukraine now is going to have a chance on the battlefield, but there's also a lot of hesitation, right? Because there's a lot of division in NATO, and we're going to get to that. But the problem for Ukraine, the problem for this whole Neocon project is that Ukraine not only doesn't have enough, and Russia has as much, if not and more, heavy weaponry, tanks, and not just the tanks, but the air, the what's called combined arms warfare, the ability to use artillery and to use airstrikes and air defense and air off, to be able to use all kinds of different systems and modes of waging war. Russia's okay. Russia's not in a shortage. Ukraine is the one that's been begging and begging and begging and begging and begging NATO and the United States, and Zelensky's been getting very, very, very bold, right? Confronting Biden, confronting Congress, saying, give us more. Thank yous are not enough. Well, Victoria Nuland seems to agree with the point that we've been making. So Victoria Nuland, this unhinged neocon, kind of just exposed how even if, right, these tanks, it's not enough, right? 30 U.S. tanks, whatever, 20 to 100 German tanks, and assortment of tanks from other countries in NATO. It's not enough because Russia is fully armed, fully equipped, and ready to go. The problem is not only that it's not enough, but it's not even going to be able to get to Ukraine for several months to get to Ukraine. And Brian Berletic wrote this really good piece in Northeastern Outlook. You can go to his community post after this, where he talks about it's not just also that it's going to take a while to get there, but you have to be able to train. And for the United States, when it succeeded in its brutal and devastating invasion of Iraq in the Gulf War and in 2003, that in both instances, the United States had military personnel in teams to work these advanced heavy tanks for years, that they had all mastered what they were individually good at, and they could come together in a team and train for another year to be able to use this tank. Well, guess what? Ukraine doesn't even have that time. Ukraine won't even get these tanks for several months. And here is Victoria Nuland telling us that Ukraine is not going to get these tanks for several months. And so this a person on Twitter said the U.S. tanks will not arrive in time for Ukraine's spring offensive. So Ukraine has been talking about, the United States has been talking about how Ukraine is going to go on an offensive after the winter, right? Who knows if it even has that much time, given how Russia has been advancing in Soledar, Bakhmut, Ugledar. There's so many places that Russia is advancing, Zaporozhye, right? It's not clear how long Ukraine even has to hold down this line. But here is Victoria Nuland talking about how these tanks are not really going to even get there by the so-called spring offensive that they're hoping Ukraine will wage. Here we go.
Abrams, as you know, are very sophisticated tanks and they require significant training. So even as we approved them yesterday, it's going to take some time to get them to the battlefield. So this is not something that's going to appear in time for the spring offensive. What is most
which
needed,
brings it, which underscores what I said. You know, we've been asking for this for 6 months. Had you started 6 months ago, they'd be all ready for the spring offensive. So what happened here? Who's to blame for this?
you know, I think at every stage of this, we have looked at what the Ukraine Abrams, as you know.
So, I mean, that's a brief clip, but you get the point. The point is that she knows that these are advanced weapons, that they take training, and that it takes a while to transfer them even. And they're not going to get there by the spring offensive. So there you have it. She's admitting that. And so a lot of this is political theater. And there have been murmurs that the reason why this is happening is because the United States and NATO understand that, sure, Ukraine won't be able to gain back territory, and perhaps a spring offensive doesn't matter. Now there are murmurs and possible theories that could be thrown out there that maybe the point is not for Ukraine to take back territory, but for there to be a larger conflict prepared around when it comes to potentially fortifying West Ukraine as a protectorate, getting other NATO countries involved in that project. We know Poland has a lot of interests in expanding its influence in this region, particularly when it comes to Ukraine and to its west. So there's a lot, and Germany is not so happy about that, which could have been the reason why Germany may not have wanted an escalation with the armaments and the heavier tanks, because maybe that would embolden a country like Poland, which, you know, is so willing to do such a thing. So there's these internecine rivalries and conflicts and competition happening within the NATO countries that shows a bit of division. So there's a lot of reasons why this is just a disaster. Or perhaps the United States and NATO are hedging their bets on a different kind of plan that they're not necessarily articulating right now out in the open. They're not necessarily articulating that perhaps there's another way to the same goal. The goal, of course, is to weaken Russia and hopefully lead to the downfall of Russia. It's a fantasy. It really is. It's something that in their minds is achievable, but in reality is not achievable. This is what happens when you have neocons who are so dedicated to their war agenda, so dedicated to their careers in profiting from these wars, that reality begins to wither away. It begins to dissolve. There's no real politic here. Even someone like Henry Kissinger, who now has kind of did a 180 and has condemned Russia and has begun talking more, I think, boldly about how Ukraine should be supported and there should be permanent war. But for a long time, Henry Kissinger was actually pushing back even against the a reality, this kind of misguided idea that Russia could be taken on by the neocons. He was pushing back against the neocons, saying, well, maybe we should actually be going for something a little more strategic, a little more reasonable, a little more realistic. But the neocons have said, absolutely not. We're going to go full force. we're going to do as much as we can, even if what we can do is not enough. So, in my opinion, I mean, my understanding of what's happening when it comes to someone like Victoria Nuland acknowledging this tank issue is I think there's both developments occurring at the same time. I think that the Biden administration knows full well that there's not going to be a Ukrainian victory. There's not going to be any taking back of territory, that's just not possible. That unless the United States and NATO decide to use their heaviest guns, which is the threat of nuclear war, which Dmitry Medvedev and a lot of Russian officials have said, that's where you're pushing us right now. That's where you're pushing the world. Medvedev has been very vocal of late, talking about how the United States and NATO are fueling a third world war. And Medvedev was very vocal saying, actually, if that were to happen, it's not going to be from airstrikes. It's not going to be with tanks. It's going to be with the nuclear button. And he's right about that. No third world war is going to be fought on the battlefield between Russia and the United States and NATO. That's not going to happen because the amount of losses, the casualties, the economic fallout from that is way too grave of a risk for all sides involved. So, that if this were to happen, then immediately the biggest guns would be taken out, right? Would be unleashed. And that's what makes it all so dangerous. That's why the nuclear doomsday clock has moved to 90 seconds to midnight. It's because of provocations like what we're seeing with the US and NATO. And so I believe, and this is just, my opinion, my analysis based on what we're seeing Victoria Nuland say, what we're seeing the United States and NATO do. I believe that both developments are true, that the United States and NATO don't believe that Ukraine can win, and at the same time understand how important it is to continue fortifying Ukraine, mainly for the military industrial complex and for the fact that at the very least militarizing Ukraine will have a desired political effect in Ukraine, meaning that there will always be US influence, US and NATO domination in that country. Then you have the fact that there could be, and I wouldn't put it past the United States and its military apparatus and these neocons to begin to think about, well, we're not just in it for profits, we're in it for the overall strategic goal, which will get the big fish, which will get the agenda that we have achieved, right? That's the most profitable in their opinion. It's the most favorable, which is the downfall of Russia. So now we're going to pivot and try a different way. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see in the coming weeks, in the coming months, even over the course of the next year, if we do see a pivot from the United States and NATO to a different kind of strategy when it comes to Ukraine. No, they're not going to end this war. They're not necessarily going to end the war, but they'll continue to try to flex different kinds of muscles as the situation changes, because, at this point, we have to understand that NATO and the US are not acting on their own. They are not just a force that can just create the reality that they want to see. No, they have decided to go up against a force that has a lot of influence itself. And what is that force? That's the Russian Federation. That's Russia. That's Vladimir Putin as in leadership. And that's the entire multipolar world that backs and supports Russia. We've seen it. South Africa can't come out and defended Russia. We see China and we see Iran. We see all these countries coming out and say, now we're with Russia. We see much of the African continent support Russia, much of Latin America, especially the leftist movements, come out against the sanctions, not listen to the sanctions. You know what I'm saying? So Russia is a force that actually has the ability to alter and change U.S. plans, that has the ability to interrupt the neocon agenda, and that also is definitely being taken into account. Which, in my opinion, with what's about to happen, what's happening on the battlefield, and what's definitely going to happen when you have 300,000 Russian troops armed with the heaviest military weaponry going on even small offensives or small reconnaissance or whatever you want, whatever the move is for Russia, it will be effective because Russia doesn't have these deficits that Ukraine has. That will cause the United States to pivot. And so we'll see what that is. But there's a lot, I think, that could be said about the United States trying to create a situation in Ukraine that will, at the very least, cement its political and economic dominance, as well as continue this reconfiguration within NATO to continue on the path forward that the neocons want to see, which is the undermining of Russia and the ultimate destruction of Russia. Again, fantasy. The neocons are not going to get what they want necessarily, but they will try to put themselves in the best situation that they can to get themselves there. So that's what I believe is going to happen. That's what I believe is we're seeing Victoria Nuland and her commentary, right, is revealing to us. Her commentary is revealing to us that the United States and NATO strategy, the way that what they've done with Ukraine had a lot of limitations from the very beginning. Those are being exposed more. The cacophony about Ukraine winning and Ukraine being so well armed and Ukraine basically showing how a small country can beat a big country and all this nonsense that blurred over all of the facts that and the disastrous conditions that were created by Victoria Nuland in large part and her team and the Obama administration and the neocons and this military industrial complex. That's all being exposed now more and more. So when you have Victoria Nuland go in front of the Senate, get questioned about her use of her understanding of these tanks, get questioned about, it's funny because the Senate, which was asking the question to her about the M1A1 Abrams, they were also wrong. No, 6 months ago, it wouldn't have made a difference anyway, right? It would probably be the same result. Maybe they could get a crash course training and who knows, maybe they'd use them, but it doesn't matter because they'd be going out there alone and they'd be vulnerable to Russian strikes. And it's likely that the outcome would still probably be the same, that the United States would have to consider not using these tanks. So it's not really a matter of time or maybe this should have been done earlier. Why was there so much bickering, disagreements, all of that? No, that's just a smokescreen to cover up the fact that the United States and NATO can't get Ukraine back to where it was on February 24th, 2022. It can't get back to that point in terms of military preparations and the capacity to wage an offensive against Russia in, amid this special military operation. But also, there's also this keen arrogance and hubris that we see from someone like Victoria Nuland, who outright says that Nord Stream pipeline, the terrorist attack, was so favorable to the United States that she's happy, just like Ted Cruz, that there's a bipartisan neocon celebration about this, that they're so happy that Russia and Germany cannot trade in this oil and the rest of Europe as well. But it was a huge deal for Germany. And so we can really read this as basically a slap in the face to Germany, which had tried to enact this political theater and say, no, the United States, you have to give your tanks before we give our tanks. But they once again, bent the knee to the United States, and they won't even say anything about this. Really, the German government should be calling into question not just the friendship with the United States, but also should there be an investigation on the United States and in Victoria Nuland being involved in that? In that investigation, given these comments that she's making, it seems quite odd that a political official as important as Victoria Nuland is to this whole entire project, historically and currently, would say such a thing and be allowed to say such a thing amid the fact that it's not even known who did this. In the U.S. government, it's not like Germany or the rest of Europe or the rest of the world really that pays attention to this doesn't have some kind of suspicion that the United States has involvement. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's how bad things are right now when it comes to this Neocon project. That's how bad things are for the U.S. project to destabilize Russia through Ukraine, this aggressive campaign to militarize Ukraine and to use Ukraine as a proxy in a just a immensely dangerous act of proxy warfare. It's not going well. Things are really desperate. And when things get desperate and things become desperate, well, there's a saying, right, that what lies in the dark will eventually come out in the light. And that's what's happening here. Victoria Nuland is being exposed as the war hawk, the neocon that she is. And she is doing so callously that, in fact, she is revealing what a lot of people do know who know anything about military warfare. I don't know much about it, but I follow people like Brian Berletic, and they say, yeah, what Victoria Nuland is just part of the truth about how these weapons are not really going to change the situation on the battlefield. They're not even going to get to some kind of offensive that they say Ukraine is going to launch in the spring, which means there probably are some other plans for Ukraine. So we're going to have to stay tuned on that because we don't know exactly what they are, but they're probably going to be dangerous, and they're probably going to involve the US and NATO trying to assert their domination over Ukraine politically and militarily and economically so that they can, alter their plans when it comes to destabilizing Russia in some other way when it is necessary and when it is quite clear. And I think it's going to become quite clear very soon that there's just no way to try to push back against Russia at this stage where Russia is at. The tide has turned, and it is not in favor of Ukraine.